So both in terms of external threats and in terms of internal rot, I guess you could call it, they thought that the creation of a national government to oversee this would, in the long run, protect the liberty and the life and the possession of property of the greatest number of American citizens.
Hi, this is Tony Williams, a senior fellow with the Bill of Rights Institute. And this year we are celebrating Constitution Day by exploring the relationship of the principles of liberty and equality and how we continue to balance these principles. For this special episode of Scholar Talk, I'm joined by Professor Carol Berkin, a distinguished historian, author, and expert on the American Revolution and women's history, to explore how the founding generation interpreted liberty and equality. As you watch this video, please think of questions you'd like to ask Dr. Berkin. We'll be bringing her back on Constitution Day to answer your questions live. Follow the link below to submit questions and receive a variety of useful resources, videos, and e-lessons on the subject of the Constitution as we lead up to the day itself. Carol, I want to thank you very much for joining us to offer your expertise and provide some historical context on liberty and equality.
Delighted to be here.
Great. Well, my first question relates to the earlier colonial period and the struggle against Great Britain. And the American colonists spoke frequently of their traditional liberties, but they also spoke of their natural rights during the resistance against Great Britain. So what were some of those liberties, and what is the difference between what they called the rights of Englishmen and natural rights?
I think people should think of natural rights in their perspective as the rights that preceded all creation of society and government. It's very John Lockean. That is an idea that there is something called the state of nature, in which people existed with no regulation and no limitation at all, and must have decided somewhere back in the mists of history, no one dared give a date to it, that maybe it would be better if they basically formed society and created a governing body that could protect those natural rights. So the natural rights come from God and from nature. That's their understanding. And they were, Jefferson describes them in the Declaration of Independence as life, liberty, and Jefferson writes the pursuit of happiness, because there's a flourish there. But the men, and we're really talking not about the revolutionary generation as a whole, we're talking about white men and white men of property. They understood that what Jefferson was saying in a kind of romanticized way was the protection of property, not just your plot of land, but rather your possessions, that you had a natural right to your life, to liberty is the hard one, because I think what they really meant, and scholars have disagreed about this, your liberty meant that you were free both in movement and free from domination by another individual. They had to step rather gingerly about this because, of course, many of them were slaveholders, which certainly denied that right to African Americans. But liberty, I believe, meant the opportunity to make one's own way in the world, both physically and in terms of economic gain, and in terms of what one thought and what one said. But the pursuit of happiness, I think, really was understood by them as the other piece of this, which was the right to retain your possessions safely, the right to keep and make use of what you have either earned by the sweat of your brow, inherited from your family. That's really what was being pursued. Happiness is, unless you assume that that means happiness, but I think Jefferson, I don't want to say led us astray, but he becomes very vague when he says the pursuit of happiness. So those are your natural rights. And as Jefferson writes in the Declaration, these are unalienable. You cannot be forced to give them up, but you also can't voluntarily give them up, apparently. It's like the leopard and his spots. The leopard can't give those spots up. And this is an optimistic view that people, psychologists later on and sociologists who have written books about people's desire to be dominated, people's desire to have someone make decisions for them, would argue with Jefferson about this. The traditional liberties, that is the rights of Englishmen that they talked about, came after the creation of government. And these were the laws, the statutes, the customs, the precedents, the policies that the government set. So when they said we have the rights of Englishmen, they're talking about the right to free speech. They're talking many of the things that ultimately become written into the Bill of Rights. The right to a trial by your peers. These are, I don't want to say artificial, but they come after the government is created. And the general understanding by the American colonists who supported the revolution was that, in fact, the social contract, the agreement between the governed and those who govern them, which Locke talked about as a social contract, that when people back in the mists of time got together and said, we're going to create a government, it was a contract that we will recognize the legitimacy of that government as long as it protected our natural rights, as long as it served the best interests of the people. At the point at which it ceased to serve the best interest of the people, the contract was broken. And I think it's interesting, students and teachers should ponder the terms, contract. This is an era really when the idea of legal agreements about things was beginning to really dominate. Another way of saying that is the rise of capitalism, that these things were beginning to develop. And so Locke speaks of it in the same way that if I signed a contract with the Bill of Rights Institute, we both had to do what we promised to do, otherwise the contract is null and void. So what Americans are saying, and you can, if you read the Declaration of Independence and you read past the preamble into the body of the Declaration of Independence, excuse me, which is the part they thought was important. It's really a kind of lawyerly brief that says, this is how the king broke the social contract. And it's interesting to look at it. I actually, never hurts for a historian of the era to reread that some of the things they accuse the king of doing relate to natural rights. That is, the first one is he's refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. You haven't done what you promised to do in terms of our natural rights. But many of them are about the post-organization of society. They're about the way in which his policies and his treatment of laws already on the books or precedents already established by the government have not been attended to, have not been obeyed. And so the Declaration of Independence shows you the way in which these two sets of rights are combined to fuel, in fact, a declaration of independence, to fuel a war for independence.
Excellent. So moving a little bit forward from the time period of the Declaration to the Constitution itself, liberties were really threatened during the 1780s, and that led to the Constitutional Convention, and men like Madison and Hamilton, Washington, and others. They wanted a stronger national government that they thought would ironically do a better job of protecting liberties than a weak government. So, and you dial into this in your book, A Brilliant Solution, which was fantastic. And can you explain how they expected this new constitutional order to better protect liberty?
Well, for one thing, the protection of your life and your liberty when there were foreign powers far more powerful. That my students often think, I once had a student who wrote, from the moment the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock, which makes me think he was not a sailor, landing on the rock is not a good idea, America was the most powerful country in the world. It's very hard sometimes to shake students, these are college students, from the belief that America's position today is the position they always had. But in fact, in the 1780s, people in Paris did not open their newspaper to find out what the people in America thought and were doing, because that was the most important thing in the world. We were a third-rate nation that they didn't think really had a chance of lasting very long. And in fact, countries like Holland and France and England were thinking, well, when that country falls apart, and if we can give it a little nudge, we can divvy it up. And we know this is true because the French ambassador at the time the Constitutional Convention was meeting is writing home to his superiors, well, what part of the United States would the king like to take when it falls apart? So clearly, men who were nationalists, that is Washington, Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris at the time, Madison, thought that 13 separate sovereign countries, which is how you really have to think about the states. They weren't administrative branches of a nation. They saw themselves as sovereign, independent powers. We're not going to be able to protect the peoples of those states against invasion, against Indian attack, against slave uprisings, which Southern states leaders, white leaders, worried about, that there were the danger to your liberty and the danger to your life were really quite real. Also, Madison, for instance, thought that the people who had taken power in Virginia were corrupt. The 18th century political leaders worried enormously about power corrupting. We need to do that more today. They really believed that the lust for power was open-ended. And Madison writes that the government of Virginia, they're squabbling over who gets what kind of power. We need a government over that government and other state governments that can take into account the needs of all the people, but who also could diminish the power of these state governments. And that's really what they wanted to do. They wanted to create a uber power that was made up of, they hoped, the very best of every state, you know, the creme de la creme of wise political men who would, in essence, discourage this kind of state level greed that Madison saw. So both in terms of external threats and in terms of internal rot, I guess you could call it. They thought that the creation of a national government to oversee this would, in the long run, protect the liberty and the life and the possession of property of the greatest number of American citizens. And that's why they were strong advocates. I don't think that it was because they themselves were power hungry. If you will allow me, Hamilton, for instance, wanted a strong national government that could take its seat at the table with the European powers, not for his own interest in his personal power was really not very, he could have quit, but he was a fabulous lawyer. If he was interested in his own wealth and his own social status and his own everything, being in the national government was not where it was at. He could have made a much better life for his family if he wanted the country to be powerful enough to protect itself always. And I think that was the nationalist motivation when they went to this convention in Philadelphia.
Thank you. Great. Well, James Madison then fights for a Bill of Rights in the first Congress after the Constitution is ratified. And the states ratified those 10 amendments. You wrote about that in your book, The Bill of Rights.
Yes.
And so can you describe the struggle to create the Bill of Rights, and how did the Bill of Rights itself protect liberties?
Yes. Even though the Constitution was ratified, a large number, a great number of American voters, that is American white men who own property, still were wary about the national government. They thought it was going to become, as they saw the English government, the government of Great Britain, it would become tyrannical. Inevitably, they believed it would become tyrannical. And what they wanted was to call a second convention and basically take away all of the powers that the national government was given. They were states' rightists in the most extreme. They believed that local government protected people's rights better than this national government would, and that they wanted to eviscerate the powers that had been given to the federal government. Well, this and the strongest advocates of this were in Madison's own home state. And so he worried a lot about this. And as those who've studied Madison know, he was a big worrier generally. And so he said, what we've got to do is we've got to, and what these opponents, by the way, had claimed, their biggest argument was, this government is intended to be tyrannical because there's no Bill of Rights in it. There's no statement about the rights of the people. That proves that danger is afoot. Well, the men who wrote the Constitution said, but most of the state governments already have a Bill of Rights in there. And our government has nothing to do with most of those issues. So why should we say we're not going to do something that we have no power to do? Let's all go home. They really wanted to go home. They'd been 4 months in Philadelphia away from their home. So Madison said that was a tactical mistake, a strategic mistake. What we've got to do is, in the first Congress, we've got to issue a Bill of Rights. And he was clever enough to say that Bill of Rights will not touch the powers of the federal government. It will guarantee all kinds of powers that American people are worried about, even though really he knew that no enforcement mechanisms were available to the federal government. he wrote this, he wrote a long, I think there were 36 or 38 rights that he included, all of which would have been recognizable to the average American white male, most of which the colonies had and the British government had endorsed. And he submitted it, and he thought, of course, Federalists, that is the nationalists, dominated in the Congress and in the presidency, and so it'll be easy going. And he was amazed to discover that the Congress said, go away, don't bother us. We've got important things we have to do. We have to set the import-export duties. We have to decide where the permanent capital is going to be. We have to create the judiciary. Leave us alone with this. We don't need this. Madison was stunned, but he persisted and he persisted and he persisted. And over the months, people finally gave in and they said, okay, all right. And ultimately, they reduced. Madison also was not a great stylist. He was not a Gouverneur Morris or an Alexander Hamilton or a Thomas Jefferson. And he made the argument that it will win over a lot of the people who are still not throwing their support to the government. It'll win over North Carolina and Rhode Island, who haven't joined the Union yet. It will diminish the push for a second convention. And everybody said, okay, fine. And they reduced it to 12 amendments. Actually, the Senate reduced it to 12 amendments. And it passed. And what is it? Madison had a very complicated mind, a very complex mind. And he said, even if we can't provide an enforcement mechanism, and we don't until the 14th Amendment after the Civil War, what we can do, what he hoped we can do, is we can establish in the minds of Americans that this is a statement, is the credo of what Americans believe in, that they will internalize the Bill of Rights. They will, I mean, he didn't use that word, but basically he hoped that people would internalize that this is what America stands for. The Bill of Rights explain what America stands for to the world and to Americans themselves. And so Madison had both practical political reasons for proposing the Bill of Rights, but he also had these really quite lofty hopes that it would become the American credo, for which I deeply admire him for maintaining. Most people are either just practical or they're pie in the sky, but Madison was able to do both.
Right.
And it did go through, Congress approved it because the few anti-federalists who were in Congress were horrified that it did not include certain things they wanted. And the one big thing they wanted would have eviscerated the power of the Constitution. They wanted that the federal government can't do anything that is not expressly, it's a very important word, expressly given to them in the Constitution. So there would be no implied powers. There would be no, and they lost on that. And then they passed it, and it was so unimportant to the men at the time that when Jefferson, as Secretary of State, announced that it had been ratified by the states, he announced it after more important things such as fishing rights had been approved. And so, no one thought it was really very important. It was symbolic. And it remained symbolic, really, until the 14th Amendment. And even after that, it's not until the 20th century that judges begin to cite it in their cases extensively, and then precedents are set that rely on the Bill of Rights. So Madison did a good deed for us.
Yes, he did. So the revolutionary and founding aspirations of liberty that we've discussed, these American creeds, you know, sometimes we've fallen short, and sometimes desperately short, and we're not yet achieved for all people. And so in what ways was liberty imperfectly achieved in America?
Well, it began falling very short.
Mhm.
When they talked about the American people, the image conjured up was white men who owned property. They essentialized, fancy word, that was the essential figure that they envisioned. Certainly women did not. I think one way to think about this is groups of Americans remained passive citizens. They did not participate actively in governing or in choosing governors. Women, indentured servants, tenant farmers, younger sons who didn't own property, certainly by race and gender, African Americans, Native Americans, all these people were left out. They were not considered qualified to be active participants in this social contract. And so from the very beginning, that's the case. Over time, what's interesting, I often draw a timeline for my students. And on that timeline, I show them that one of the great engines of American history is the struggle to turn these groups into active citizens. And the first one is all white men, regardless of whether they own property. The second one temporarily was Black men after the American Civil War. And I always give a big X when students write Black people got the vote, because Black women did not. And then in the 20th century, women got the vote. And then in the civil rights movement, Black people, male and female, once again got the right to vote. So this is one of, I think, the great engines of our history. And it shows you a kind of striving by these groups. It didn't just happen automatically. Oh, gee, we forgot you. Come on aboard. Oh, come on aboard. It is one of the great struggles in American society, and it goes on to this day. And I think that it stems from the fact that there stands the Bill of Rights, and there stands the Constitution that says you are not living up to what you claim is your manifesto, your credo. And so that struggle goes on, and hopefully we will reach a point where not only is it fully inclusive, but there is no backtracking. There is no, here, Black men, you can vote. Wait a minute, no, you can't vote, because we've introduced Jim Crow laws. So hopefully everyone will be active citizens. That's what I think those of us who enshrine in our own minds the Constitution and the Bill of Rights hope for.
Carol, I want to thank you very much, and we'll end on that hopeful note. And I want to thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to you joining us on Constitution Day as well.
Mm-hmm. I'll be there.
Great. So what questions or comments occurred to you throughout this video? Please use the link below to send them directly to Dr. Berkin and me, and we'll answer them on Constitution Day. In the meantime, please check out our other videos we have specifically designed for Constitution Day, including an analysis of the Constitution itself and why it is relevant to students with Anastasia Bowden, constitutional expert and senior attorney at the Pacific Legal Foundation. Also, a trip to Mount Vernon to explore what historic structures can teach us about the complexity of our country's founding, and more. So we'll be exploring these issues all year, so stay involved with us on social media and look out for many more events and ways to get involved. Thank you.